Daniel Morgan stood at the edge of the colony walls with his rifle in hand.
Ow.
The night was loud with alarms, and the sky burned red from the fires that spread across the settlement. Smoke rose in the distance, and the screams of people running for safety cut through the noise of gunfire. He was young, only 22, but already he had seen enough battles to know what fear looked like. Tonight was worse than anything before. Invaders had broken through, and the royal family was still inside the main hall. He ran through the smoke-filled streets, moving past fallen buildings and broken glass. He could hear children crying and women calling out for loved ones. Every step he took reminded him why he had chosen to fight. He had promised himself he would protect as many people as he could, no matter the cost. The sound of explosions shook the ground under his boots as he reached the main hall. Guards were scattered, some injured, some gone. The great stone doors were cracked, and the hall was filled with firelight. Inside, Princess Claire was trapped. She stood behind a broken column, her long dress torn and stained with ash. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, as shadows moved closer to her. She was young, not yet ready for the crown, but in that moment, she was only a frightened girl who had nowhere to run. Her guards had fallen one by one, and now she was alone. She pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath as the enemy closed in. Daniel rushed forward. He shouted her name, his voice breaking through the noise. Claire turned, her eyes meeting his, and for a second she thought she saw a ghost. But he was real, standing tall, despite the chaos around them. He fired his rifle, clearing a path, and ran to her side. She could smell the smoke on his uniform, and the sweat of battle clung to him. He grabbed her hand and pulled her out from behind the column. "Stay close to me," he told her, his voice firm but calm. She nodded, unable to speak. Her heart raced as he guided her through the falling debris. The heat of the flames licked at their faces, but he did not slow down. He moved with purpose, shielding her with his own body whenever danger drew near. She could hear his heavy breathing, smell the faint trace of leather and steel on him, and feel the strength of his hand holding hers. They ran through the hall as the roof began to give way. Claire stumbled, her legs weak, but Daniel lifted her into his arms without hesitation. She gasped as he carried her, his steps steady and strong. For a moment, the world outside the storm of fire faded, and all she knew was the safety she felt in his hold. She buried her face against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, something warm and human that gave her courage. He pushed through the broken doors and into the night air. Explosions lit the sky, and ash fell like snow around them. He kept moving, weaving through the rubble and flames, never once letting go of her. Every time she looked at him, she saw determination in his eyes, as if nothing in the world could make him stop. He did not think of himself, only of getting her to safety. Finally, they reached the outer walls where other survivors had gathered. Claire felt the cool night breeze against her face as Daniel set her down gently on the ground. "No?" She looked at him, her chest rising and falling with every breath, and for the first time since the night began, she felt hope. He gave her a small nod, almost like a promise that she would live, then turned back toward the flames to continue fighting. She wanted to call after him, to tell him not to leave, but the words never came. All she could do was watch as he disappeared back into the fire. The memory of his arms carrying her, the sound of his voice, and the scent that clung to him would never leave her. It was burned into her heart, deeper than the scars of the night. From that moment on, she knew she would never forget the soldier who had saved her life. The night was quiet in the palace, but inside Claire's heart there was no peace. Days had passed since the last attack, yet the memory of fire and fear still lived in her mind. She often found herself walking through the garden in silence, thinking of Daniel. He had become a captain now, standing guard at her side more often than before. Every time she saw him, the memory of that night returned, when his arms had carried her through smoke and death. The scent of him, the strength of him, it was all still alive in her thoughts. Daniel moved like a shadow through the halls. He never spoke more than needed, never showed pride in what he had done. To him, saving her life had been duty. But Claire knew it was more than that. She had seen his eyes in the middle of battle, steady and full of courage. She had felt the warmth of his hold. She knew he could have left her behind and saved himself, but he had not. And now, though he walked only a few steps from her, he felt worlds away. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the palace lamps flickered, Claire asked him to meet her in the garden. He bowed and agreed, though his face gave nothing away. She waited by the fountain, her hands folded, her heart racing. When he came, the air seemed to grow heavier. Stood straight, his eyes on her, waiting for her words. "Daniel," she said softly, "I have carried a memory for many years. Do you remember the night of the fires when you saved me?" He nodded once, but his gaze stayed firm. "I remember, princess. I did what I was sworn to do." Her chest tightened at his words. "To you it was duty, but to me it was everything. I would not be standing here if not for you." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I remember the sound of your voice, the strength of your hands, and even your scent in the air. It gave me courage when I had none." Daniel shifted slightly as though her words weighed on him. "Princess, those were dark times. I am glad I could serve. But I am a soldier. You are meant for greater things." Claire shook her head. "Greater things mean nothing if my heart is empty. I have watched you for years, Daniel. I have seen how you live with honor, how you protect without seeking reward. I cannot ignore what I feel. You gave me life once, and since then, you have given me hope." For the first time, his eyes softened. He looked at her not as a princess, but as a woman. His voice was low when he spoke. "You honor me more than I deserve." They stood in silence, the sound of water from the fountain filling the air. Claire wanted to reach for him, but fear held her still. She knew the laws of the court, the whispers that would spread if she chose him. But she also knew that courage was not only in battles, it was also in truth. The next day, the court gathered in the great hall. Nobles spoke of alliances, of marriages that would bring power and wealth. Claire listened, her face calm, but her heart restless. When they pressed her to speak, she rose slowly. Her voice carried across the hall, steady and clear. "I have chosen already," she said. "It's not for gold, not for land, but for honor and for love. There is one who saved me when all was lost, and he has stood by me ever since. I will not turn away from him." Gasps filled the hall, but Claire did not falter. She turned toward Daniel, who stood at the side, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Their eyes met, and for the first time she saw surprise in his face. Then something deeper. Respect? Hope? Perhaps even love. The room was silent, but Claire did not care. Her choice was made. Whatever storm came, she would face it with him. She remembered the night he carried her through the fire, and now she knew he would carry her through every trial that lay ahead. And this time, she would not let him walk away. The great hall was filled with people from many parts of the kingdom. Nobles and guards stood together, voices rising in talk of trade, land, and future plans. The sound of footsteps echoed across the stone floor as servants moved quietly with trays of wine. Princess Claire walked with grace among them, her dress flowing behind her, her crown shining in the light of the chandeliers. She greeted each guest with calm words, but inside her thoughts were far away. She had lived many years since the night of fire, but the memory of the soldier who saved her life still lived in her heart. She thought perhaps she would never see him again, but fate had other plans. She stepped through the hall. She caught something faint, something that made her stop. A familiar scent reached her, warm and sharp at the same time. Her chest tightened, her breath caught. She froze in her steps as the memory rushed back. The smoke, the heat, the arms that had carried her. She turned quickly, her eyes searching the crowd. There he was. Daniel Morgan stood near the edge of the hall, dressed now in the uniform of a captain. His shoulders were broader, his face older, but his eyes were the same. He stood tall, watchful, not speaking unless spoken to, his hand resting near his sword. He was not a boy anymore, but a man who had carried years of duty. Yet to her, he was still the one who had lifted her from the flames. Claire's heart raced. She moved toward him slowly, every step heavy with memory. Daniel noticed her and bowed deeply, his eyes not rising to meet hers. He spoke with respect, his voice low. "Princess." Her voice trembled when she answered. "Do you not remember me?" Daniel hesitated. "I remember, but I did only what was my duty." His words were simple, but to Claire they carried the weight of the years she had lived with his memory. She looked at him closely, taking in the lines on his face, the strength in his stance, the calm he carried even in the middle of so many people. She remembered the smell of smoke on him, the heat of his hand holding hers, and the safety she had felt in his arms. It was not only duty to her, It was something she had carried deep inside her soul. "You were the one who saved me," she whispered, her eyes never leaving his. "I remember that night as if it were yesterday. I remember your voice, the way you did not let go of me. I remember everything." Daniel looked at her finally, his eyes steady but filled with a quiet struggle. "Princess, I never wished for you to remember me. I am only a soldier. You are meant for more than I can give." Claire shook her head, her heart full. "You gave me life. That is more than anyone can give." They stood together in silence as the hall carried on with music and voices. To the others, it looked like a simple moment between a princess and her guard. But to Claire, it was everything. Her hands trembled at her sides. She wanted to reach for him, but held back, afraid of what others might see. Yet her eyes told the truth, her lips could not speak. She had waited years for this moment, and now that it had come, she did not want it to end. Daniel bowed again, his face calm, though his heart was not. He turned slightly, ready to return to his post, but Claire's voice stopped him. "I will not forget again," she said softly. "No matter how many years pass, I will not forget you." He paused, then gave her the smallest of nods. His duty pulled him away, but her words followed him like a shadow. As he walked back into the hall, she stood still, her heart racing. For the first time since the night of the fire, she felt that the distance between them might one day close. She knew now that destiny had not brought him back to her for nothing. The days after the gathering were restless for Claire. Her mind stayed fixed on Daniel. She remembered every moment of their short talk, every word he spoke with such restraint. Every time his eyes had almost revealed the truth behind them, she longed to speak to him again, but the rules of the court made it difficult. She was expected to spend her time with nobles and council members, to listen to talks of land, alliances, and politics. Yet none of those things mattered to her as much as the quiet presence of the soldier who had once carried her through fire. Daniel continued his duties without fail. He stood guard at her side during council, followed at a distance during her walks, and kept to the shadows whenever she entertained guests. He never stepped out of line, never let his gaze linger too long, but Claire could sense the wall he had built around himself. She knew he kept his distance because he thought it was right, because he saw himself only as her protector and nothing more. But she could not forget the way she had felt in his arms, the way her heart had raced when she smelled the faint trace of leather and steel clinging to him. That memory was alive inside her, and no rule of court could silence it. One night she left the palace hall and slipped quietly into the garden. The moon shone bright and the air was cool with the smell of roses. She walked by the fountain and sat on the stone edge, waiting. Minutes later, she heard footsteps. Daniel appeared, his uniform neat, his sword at his side. He bowed once, as always, and waited for her to speak. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft, "why do you always hide behind duty?" He lifted his head, surprise in his eyes, but he quickly lowered them again. "It is my place, princess. To serve and to protect. Nothing more." She shook her head, her hands tightening on her lap. "But I do not see you only as a soldier. I see you as the man who gave me hope when I thought I would die. Do you not feel what I feel?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, then stopped, as though the distance between them was a wall he could not cross. "What I feel does not matter. You are meant for a throne. I am meant for battlefields. That is the truth." Claire stood, her eyes bright under the moonlight. "Truth can be more than duty, Daniel. Truth can be what lives in our hearts. I have spoken with princes and lords, and none of them move me. But when I stand near you, I remember what it is to feel safe, what it is to feel alive." Daniel's silence stretched, heavy with meaning. He wanted to turn away, but her words held him still. For the first time, he allowed himself to meet her gaze. In her eyes, he saw not a princess, but a woman who had carried his memory for years. He felt the same pull, the same bond that had begun the night he carried her through fire. His chest rose and fell with the weight of unspoken words. "Claire," he whispered, breaking formality for the first time, "you deserve more than I can ever give." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the shimmer of tears in her eyes. "I deserve truth. And the truth is that I have never forgotten you." Daniel's hands curled into fists at his side. He longed to reach for her, but the rules of the court pressed on him like chains. He bowed his head, his voice rough. If the world were different, I would not hold back. But I cannot break the vow I gave to protect you. That is the only way I know to serve you. Her heart ached at his words, but she did not turn away. She touched his arm lightly, her fingers brushing the fabric of his sleeve. Then protect me not only with your sword, but with your truth. Let me carry that with me, even if nothing else can change. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a quiet fire inside. He gave a small nod, not a promise of love spoken aloud, but an unspoken vow that one day he might allow himself to be more than her guard. As he returned to his post that night, Claire stood by the fountain, her heart steady. She knew their bond had grown stronger, even if it still hid beneath shadows. And she knew that time would bring a moment when neither of them could deny it any longer. The kingdom woke to the sound of warning bells. Riders brought news of enemy forces gathering on the borders. Fear spread quickly through the streets, and the palace filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and clashing steel as soldiers prepared for battle. Princess Claire stood at the window of her chamber, her hands trembling as she watched men march into the courtyard. She knew this was not like the small raids of the past. This was war, and the enemy would come for the crown. She also knew Daniel would be among those who stood on the front lines. Daniel moved with calm focus, giving orders to younger soldiers and making sure the defenses were ready. His face showed no fear, but inside his thoughts were heavy. He knew the enemy wanted to break the heart of the kingdom, and that meant they would strike at the palace itself. More than once he looked toward the high windows of the tower, where he knew Claire would be watching. He had sworn to protect her, but he also knew the cost of war. He had seen men fall, and he knew his life could be the next one taken. When the first attack began, fire lit the night sky once more. Arrows rained down, and the gates shook under the force of enemy rams. Daniel fought at the front, his sword flashing in the light of flames, while he led his men with courage, pushing back wave after wave. Yet no matter how many fell, more came, pressing harder against the walls. Shouts of pain and the clash of steel filled the air. Claire stood with the council, but her eyes searched only for one figure in the chaos. Every time she caught sight of Daniel, her heart eased, only to grow heavy again when he disappeared into the smoke. At last the gates cracked open, and the enemy poured inside. The palace halls shook with the sound of battle. Claire refused to hide, even as her advisors begged her to go to safety. She moved through the stone corridors until she found herself near the great hall, where the fighting grew louder. There at the center of the storm was Daniel. He fought like a man who carried not only his own life, but the life of his people. Blood stained his arm, yet he did not stop. He struck down one foe after another, his eyes burning with determination. When he saw her standing at the edge of the hall, his heart stopped. For a moment he wanted to shout at her to leave, to hide, but instead he fought harder, carving a path to her. He reached her side and grabbed her hand just as he had years before. "Stay with me," he said, his voice firm despite the chaos. She nodded, her trust in him absolute. Together, they moved through the battle. Daniel shielded her, his sword flashing, his body a barrier between her and danger. Claire held close, her breath fast, her heart pounding. She could smell again the same mix of steel, sweat, and smoke that she had known years ago. It filled her with both fear and strength. The memory of the past had returned, but this time, she was not only a frightened girl. This time she stood by him, ready to face whatever came. At last the tide turned. Reinforcements from the outer villages arrived, and the enemy began to fall back. The palace floor was stained with blood, and the cries of the wounded filled the air, but the kingdom had survived. Daniel, wounded but alive, stood tall beside Claire. His chest rose and fell with exhaustion, but his eyes never left hers. Before the gathered court, with soldiers and nobles watching, Claire stepped forward. Her voice carried strong and clear. "This man is not only my protector. He is the one who gave me life when I thought it was lost. Tonight, he has given me and all of us life again. I will not hide my truth any longer. I choose him, not as a guard, but as the one who stands beside me in all things." Gasps filled the hall, but Claire did not waver. Daniel stared at her, torn between duty and the pull of his heart. Slowly he lowered his sword, and for the first time he let the wall around him break. He bowed his head, not as a soldier, but as a man who loved her. When he looked up, their eyes met, and she knew the bond that began in fire had now been sealed in truth. The kingdom watched in silence as the princess and the soldier stood side by side. The scent, the memory, the unspoken promise had carried them to this moment. No throne, no law, no fear could part them now. Together they had faced death, and together they would face whatever future waited,